What's up, you guys? How are you doing today? Oh, nice. That was so sad. That's okay. It's fine. I understand. So we've got a great afternoon for you guys, but I've got some announcements for you. So I need you kind of just to tune in for a sec, hot sec, quick sec. First of all, we just want to apologize because there was a lot of confusion about this worldview assignment. I know there was in my group, and they all told me the right date, and I told them the wrong date, and there was just whole hullabaloo. Basically, what you need to know is that this assignment is worth 20% of your grade. That is why the deadline is pushed back to November 15th. We want to give you time because this takes effort. This takes some thought because it is worth 20% of your grade. And it is Terra Firma, but you gotta put forth some gusto, if you will. So we just want to give you that time to actually put forth a little bit of effort, put forth a little bit of thought, so that you can do well. We want you to do well. That's our goal in this. Next, I want to talk to you about the academic integrity policy. How many of you have read this? Okay, more than I thought, honestly. Basically, what we want to tell you guys is that is up on Moodle for you to read through in case there is any sort of confusion as to what our academic integrity policy looks like. Basically, there is a difference between just throwing in a quote and then citing a quote is a good way to make sure that you're not committing fraud and saying that some work is yours when it's not. That's just a basic part of it. So make sure you take a look at that. Make sure you're familiar with that because it is an integral part of your academic experience. And then last but not least, we have a ton of events going on this weekend. First of all, we have Family Weekend. There is still time to register, so you can bring your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, your cousin, your aunt, your uncle, whoever you want. It's Family Weekend. And we want you to bring your family so they can kind of see what you experience here at CU. We have a lot of fun events for you to participate in, and we would love to see your family around campus. Also, we have Night of Nets at the men's soccer game on Friday at 7 p.m. This is a huge event. Night of Nets is really important to us, as you heard about last week. So just come out, encourage the men's soccer team. We'd love to see you there. Have a really bumpin' student section. That'd be great. Another event that's coming up is Pop Scholars. Do any of you know what Pop Scholars is? No, not really. A few of you. It's an improv group, and this is a free event for Cornerstone students. So it's a comedy group. So if you love to laugh and you want to hear some funny improv, some witty remarks, you can come hang out. It'll be a good time. And the last thing is Halloween roller skating. So this is coming up this Tuesday. Guys, this is my favorite event that KUSA does. My absolute favorite event. I'm so excited. You get to dress up. You get to skate around. Is anyone more graceful on roller skates than they are on the ground? I am. So it's okay for you to raise your hand because I'm with you. So you can kind of bust some moves as you're skating around, or you can fall on your butt, and it's going to be okay. Our friend will be there to help you back up, and you'll be wearing a costume, so it'll be a lot of fun. We have a lot of speakers today. So first, I would like to welcome up Emily Gratzen. She is the Associate Dean of Assessment and Student Success, and she has her master's in Spanish and Linguistics.
Thank you, Shanna. Wow, I need to come to Terra Firma every week to hear about all the cool events going on. I didn't know Pop Scholars were coming here. I have a couple of friends that are actually a part of that group. I graduated with them, so that's pretty neat. So you guys should definitely attend that and all the other events. As Shanna said, my name is Emily Gratzen. I'm the Associate Dean of Assessment and Student Success. Imagine with me, if you will, if this is working, and maybe I need to turn this on, pushing the big green button. But the big green button is not advancing. Thank you very much. Imagine with me that your roommate has had a very busy week and hasn't had time to complete the Terra Firma assignment due tomorrow or due on November 15. Wonderful. We're going to imagine then it's the 14th, right? She sits down to work on it, but she can't quite seem to know where or how to start, right? We've all been there. Those creative juices aren't quite flowing. Since you have already completed the assignment, she asks if she can see your paper to get an idea of what the assignment is asking. What would you do? Or what should you do in that case? Now imagine that you are working on a research paper from your REL 104 class. Throughout the course of a couple of weeks, you read countless articles and books related to your topic. When it comes time to sit down and begin to actually write the paper, you realize that you forgot to jot down the source of a couple of the key quotes and ideas that you're hoping and really planning to incorporate as part of your paper. After complaining about this to your roommate, He tries to convince you that it's really not an issue at all, so long as you put it into your own words. And besides, he says, there's so many books and articles out there that no one will ever know the difference. No one will know. What would you do? Or what should you do? These scenarios aren't only just made-up scenarios. These are actual examples that I've heard from students when I've sat down with them and talked about our academic integrity policy. So I wanted to share a couple of these scenarios with you before I jump into what academic integrity actually is. You will be discussing these scenarios in your small groups when you break out for discussion. But first, let's talk about what is academic integrity. Okay, and to do that, I'm going to back up and talk about what is integrity. I think a lot of us probably know what that is, or if we had to describe a person with integrity, we'd be able to do that. But according to Merriam-Webster, the short definition is that integrity is the firm adherence to a code of especially moral or artistic values. Okay, so doing the right thing when no one's looking. Academic integrity, then, is taking that and really putting it or applying it to the academic context. Okay, so in the academy. So they're essential values which allow the community to exist and really prosper. And it doesn't only refer to the final product, but also to the process that you went through to produce that product. So academic integrity here at Cornerstone is something that we take very seriously, not only because we are an institution of higher education and we value this idea of doing the right thing, but also even more so because we're a Christian institution of higher education. And as people of faith, we're called to live with integrity and act honestly in all that we do, even in your coursework, even when no one's looking. So in identifying or describing to you, defining a little bit more of what academic integrity is, sometimes it's more helpful to know what it isn't. So we say, okay, act with integrity, act honestly as you go about and do your work and in your courses. But what does it look like to do the opposite, to not do that? And as part of Cornerstone's policy, we've really identified 4 main areas of what it isn't. And that's really to help you. And a lot of these should be familiar. You've probably seen some of these in high school. But I want to go over these with you really quickly. So we refer to these as 4 primary violations, or another way we refer to it as academic dishonesty incidences. So the first one is cheating, right? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So really it is using unauthorized material or study aids for assistant on examinations or other academic work. So looking at a peer's exam, altering a graded exam, using notes without permission during a test. Okay, so cheating. The second one is fabrication. So it's submitting altered or contrived information in any academic assignment. So if we think back to that second scenario, could possibly be making up a source and just hoping that the professor doesn't notice. Okay, that would be falsifying information. Okay, lying, not acting with integrity. Thirdly, plagiarism. This is the common one, and Shanna referred to this. Willfully submitting as part or all of one's work material that is copied or paraphrased from another source, including online, and I would say and especially online sources, without proper acknowledgement of that source. Okay? We need to give credit where credit is due. Even if you're just borrowing an idea or have used that as a starting point, we need to give credit to that person, that organization, that source. Okay, so really making sure that we're doing that. If it's a direct quote, we're citing it. We're making sure to reference it in our works cited or bibliography, depending on whether we're using MLA, APA, Chicago, or the Turabian. I know in REL, there's a bunch of different other languages, if you will. And then fourthly, and most importantly, and I say most importantly because this is the one that I tend to meet with students the most on, facilitating academic dishonesty. Sometimes we don't think of this one as a violation of academic integrity, but really it's helping another student violate this policy. And an important key piece, whether intentional or unintentional. So it's allowing one's work to be copied. Think back to that first scenario. Your roommate is stressing, needs some help. You just want to help them get some ideas flowing. Is it okay to share your paper with them? According to this one, no. Instead, you can talk about it, and you'll talk in your groups. What are some other ways that you can help your roommate in that situation? What we really want to do is you need to protect your work, right? And make sure, don't put that temptation in front of that person. I've met with so many students who've said, but I didn't mean for them to copy it, and I told them not to copy it, or they told me they weren't going to copy it. And so let's take a step back and make sure that we're helping each other act with integrity. So those are the four main areas or violations, if you will, of academic integrity according to Cornerstone's policy. Real briefly, though I know and I hope none of you will ever have to go through this or meet with me because of this. I hope to meet with you for other reasons. But for your first offense, the automatic penalty is a failing grade on the assignment, whether that was a homework assignment or a final exam. It's a failing grade on that. If you're reported for a second time, it's a failing grade in the course, and then a third time possible suspension. Faculty, I do want to tell you, faculty are required to report. So they're not doing it to be mean. They're doing it so that we can uphold this ideal, right, of holding each other accountable and making sure that we're acting with integrity in all that we do. So they will be reporting it to me, and I will work through it from there. So really quickly, okay, 4 violations. What can I do to avoid that? Okay, what are some practical things that I can do? So first of all, some of these may seem very obvious. Plan ahead, okay? Thinking back to the first scenario, that would have helped that roommate if she were able to think through that. So not to put herself in that circumstance where, the assignment was due 2 hours, and sometimes that causes you to cut corners that you really shouldn't. Always document your research. When you're looking at articles and jotting down ideas, make sure you're also jotting down where you've taken that from. Or at a minimum, keep those articles. Either store them electronically in a file on your computer or print them out, store them in a physical file. Okay, but document your process. Document where you're borrowing or taking those ideas from so that you can give credit to them later. This third point I think is really important. It's something that I like to encourage students to do. Make sure that when you sit down to actually type out or produce the assignment, unless it's a group project, okay, there are clearly those types of projects in your courses in which you're supposed to be working on it with other people. If it's not, make sure you're sitting down by yourself. Again, you can avoid all of that temptation of, I know sometimes I've had students say that they were typing on it and talking about it, and they didn't realize that what they were typing was the exact same thing. Okay, and whether that may or may not be the case, but to avoid that, just chat about the assignment, go sit down separately and type it up or write it out or whatever it is that you're doing. Never share your work with others. Never give your physical copy of your work. But feel free, this is an academic community, share your ideas, discuss the big pictures, right? Discuss the course content and feel free to help out your classmates, your roommates. Just don't give them the actual product, whether it's a paper, etc. And then, when in doubt, ask the professor, ask me. If you don't know whether or not this is a paraphrase or a direct quote, we have the writing center. You can sit down and meet with a writing tutor, but we want to help you. Or if you're wondering whether or not you should cite a source, cite it, right? Be safe. So that's just a little bit, again, about our academic integrity policy. I hate that this is the first thing that I'm meeting a lot of you with. I hope to meet all of you individually at some point. Maybe not in the context of this, unless you're asking me questions and want to learn more. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to come and share a little bit about this policy.
Thank you so much, Emily. Before we have our next friend join us, I rushed through a lot of the announcements and forgot to mention the days and the times. My bad. I was really excited. There's a lot to say. So I'm going to run through that super fast. For the Night of Nets soccer game, that's Friday night at 7 p.m. And then the Pop Scholars comedy event is going to be Saturday night at 8 p.m. There's going to be so many times. I know. There's no way to keep it straight. And then Halloween roller skating is not actually on Halloween. It's the day before Halloween, because we want to allow you to, do your own shenanigans on Halloween. So it's Monday night, and that's 9 to 11. It's a little late night skate for you. Really good time. All right, and now I want to welcome our next friend up, Gerald Longjohn, who is the VP of Student Development and just friend to our campus, a good friend of mine. So just welcome him back up.
Thank you, Shanna, for the introduction and for using the words hullabaloo and shenanigans. in the same context. Hey, so I don't know if you've noticed, but college gets stressful. Anybody notice that? Some of you are doing it wrong. If you're not raising your hands, you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I was supposed to do something this week. It's called going to class. So many of the stress factors are pretty obvious. Again, like, categorize this section as like, yes, I knew that already. But here are some of the obvious stress factors. First of all, it's your professors, right? No, your professors aren't stressing you out. It's a new pace, a new academic process. I remember being astonished at my schedule. Here's how I pictured college was going to work when I arrived at my undergrad institution. I thought we went to class from 8 to 3 o'clock every day, just like high school. And I got my schedule, I'm like, there's no class at 8 o'clock on a couple of these days. Like, I literally had no idea how that was supposed to work. I didn't know that if I felt like it, I could occasionally sleep right through class. I did that actually my very first day of class because my alarm didn't go off. But also didn't think about the fact that my teachers weren't doing homework checks, sort of like high school, and they weren't able to talk to my parents, so I wasn't having my parents asking me if I got my homework done. Of course, by the time I figured out that I had a little more responsibility for my academic progress, it was now past fall break, and I had literally one weekend to read the entire Old Testament for the class that I was coming back to. That was a good time. I was traveling with my dad that weekend, and literally all I remember was staying up an entire night trying to read all the way through the major and minor prophets, which gives you really weird dreams in the midst of that. So there's the academic stress. Some of the stress is relational. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm guessing that a couple of you have had those moments where you're like, I am so done with my roommate. Don't look at them right now. That's not kind. Or at least you're kind of wondering what strange social experiment does student development do during the summer when they match you with these people? You're like, I filled out a form and everything. Those all go in the shredder. No, I'm just kidding. They don't all go in the shredder. We do our best. But there's probably that level of relational stress. My guess, if you're willing to admit it, is that there's the stress of being away from your family. For some of us who just home has been a place of stability and security, and now when all the other stresses are going, you find yourself like, I miss being at home. If nothing else, you miss the family dog. Like, I get that. See, now suddenly I've lost several of you. You're like, look at the picture, he's so cute. But there's all of those stress factors that start to grow up. Here's what I want to talk about today. I don't want to talk about stress, but it's related. There is actually some factors under the surface, or that will be under the surface, contributing to a different type of stress that is really kind of, it's both exciting and it's both terrifying. It's both painful and also really fruitful in our lives. Let me explain. So when you read a lot of social scientists who look at this season, there are several of them who are desperately trying to figure you out. Let me explain. They're looking, there's lots of books, there's journal articles about this, and during this season, you're leaving adolescence behind. So let's, over here is adolescence. Anybody kind of thankful you're leaving adolescence behind? Some of you are like, nope, it's great. So you're leaving adolescence behind, but a lot of the markers that historically marked kind of adulthood, sort of the social factors, things like establishing your own independent living, so a home, apartment, something like that. For some people, establishing a family, getting married, having kids, moving into a career that kind of was more like kind of your lifelong career rather than a transitional job, finishing up school. A lot of those simply are becoming delayed longer and longer. That's not a critique, it's just a statement of how our economy and how our society has shifted. And so the question is what do we do with this season between adolescence and adulthood? So they creatively came up with the term emerging adulthood. In other words, it's this process, and they estimate somewhere between anywhere from 4 to sometimes 7 or 8 years where a lot of things happen. I made the list. Here's some of the things that happen during that. One of the things that happens is cognitively, our ability for reflective, critical thought grows. particular if you're in a philosophy class with Bonzo or World Civ with Spence or Benson, but suddenly you're able to think about things a little differently. Your motivation for morality shifts. You're moving from ideas about kind of reward or punishment, or I do things because I'm a good boy, I do things because you start moving to like what is just, what is right, the things we're passionate about. Our identities are reconsidered. Again, no show of hands, but my guess is some of us began our time at Cornerstone thinking, I'd like to be known a little differently than I was in high school. A friend of mine had gone all the way through elementary and high school as Catherine. When she came to college, she's like, nope, I'm Kate. Like that was a simple thing, but it illustrates sometimes we're trying to think through, I want to be different. I want my identity to change. It's almost like we're in sort of an out-of-body experience trying to decide, how do I want to change myself, or at least how do I figure out who I actually am? But also during this season, we're wrestling with bigger questions about our faith. We're wrestling with questions about our beliefs, beginning the process from what is sometimes called inherited faith, the beliefs, practices that I've taken in from my parents or from my family, to owned faith, what I believe personally and how that affects my choices. There's a writer named Sharon Parks who has really helpfully described some of this, and she boils all of that down to one simple term. She says it's the storm. And here's what she says about the storm. Her thesis is that the storm is both expected and it's necessary. You don't get to mature faith without going through the storm. It's stressful, it's scary at times, it's overwhelming. But on the other side, we not only discover the story that we believe to be most true, but God uses the storm to help us better and understand and embrace his story. To make the journey from inherited to owned faith, Sharon Parks says, and I believe it because I've seen it in my own life, you have to go through the storm. Think about a couple of these terms. It's expected. I've been working in both youth ministry and college ministry now for over 20 years, and I've not met a follower of Christ who hasn't made that transition through early adulthood without experiencing the storm in some way. It varies in severity and type. The reality is some of us may already be there gathered in this room, but the storm is expected. She also says it's necessary, and I'm convinced, and thankfully, all these researchers in faith formation agree with me, or better yet, I agree with them, that the storm is necessary. If you've come here with an inherited faith, please hear me, that's not a bad thing. The gift that your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, the people who may be coming to visit you this weekend for family weekend, that they've given you in shaping you as a person of faith is important. But the storm is going to deepen that. It's going to help it grow. It's necessary. Some of you haven't grown up in a Christian home. Maybe you've come to faith later in life. This may be all brand new to you. But the storm is still necessary in your life as well. It'll test the foundation. It can kind of unsettle you, but in a good way. It does what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, your life is tested. Some people build their house on sand. Some people build their house on a rock. And the storm actually tests the quality of the foundation. Okay, so if the storm is expected and if it's necessary, what does it look like? I wrote down some ideas here. I'm going to suggest 3 possible types of storm. There's probably more categories, but this has helped me think it through, and hopefully it'll be enough to get you thinking. The first is the external storm. That's a pretty simple definition. It's the things that happen outside of us, but the things that directly affect us. So here's my list. External storm, relational breakdown or relational difficulty. So maybe that's the loss of a friendship. Maybe that's the pain of a breakup. Maybe it's, quite honestly, this is one of the toughest things, and sadly, this often marks the college years. It's the disintegration of your parents' marriage. That's an external storm, something that happens outside of you, but that affects you. I was thinking about the external storm of financial stress. Often it's not just that college is expensive, which it is, but it's the stress of trying to help cover those expenses, the job, looking at the budget, realizing the debt that you're taking on, and then suddenly books are more expensive than you expected, and then suddenly your car breaks down, and this is a storm. It's outside of you, but it affects you. Another external storm, disappointment in people that you respect, people that you have admired. Maybe someone that you trusted or respected does something that suddenly reveals just how human and flawed and sinful they are. And somebody that you thought like, man, that's It's like Jesus and them. It's an external storm. You're having to wrestle through that. Here's one that doesn't need much description. It's the storm of grief and loss. Someone that you're close to passes away. And I don't know of any storm that pummels us with greater ferocity. That's the external storm. But there's also internal storms, aren't there? Let me go through the list that came to my mind. This is, again, the stuff that maybe other people wouldn't notice. If the external storm is happening out here but affecting you in here, the internal storm may be like nobody knows. But here's the internal storm. It may be loneliness. You just feel like people around you don't know you, or even worse, that people around you don't get you. It's not just that you don't know people, it's that they don't know you. There's the internal storm of depression, of anxiety. It may show up in varying levels at various times, but all studies indicate that more and more of us on a college campus are dealing with some level of depression and anxiety. It could be that internal storm of not feeling like you have any idea what you're doing next, the lack of direction or clarity. The storm shows up and we're like, I don't know what my major is. I thought I had one career plan, but it's not working out and I don't get it. There's also the internal storm of sexual struggle and the shame that goes with that. This is often an inner turmoil that has to do with whether it's same-sex attraction, or it's an addiction to pornography, or it's premarital sexual activity, or the list could go on, and it's not only what's happening, but it's the way that we view ourselves because of it, the shame that starts to pile up. So we have external storms, we have internal storms. There's also a little different kind of storm that's kind of harder to categorize, but I would call it the philosophical storm. Here's some of the questions that show up in the philosophical storm. Questions about the Bible. Is it accurate? Is it trustworthy? Is it actually the source of truth? Questions about the existence, the nature of God, perhaps for the first time or in a greater intensity than we've ever experienced. Questions about the authority of the church. We start looking at the church and we're like, it's kind of messed up. It's a bunch of hypocrites. And that piles on this philosophical question. Or maybe it's questions about whether the gospel is actually exclusive or not. Is Jesus Christ really the only way to peace with God? What about Muslims? What about Buddhists? What about Jews? What about sincere, kind, moral atheists? So here's the question. Do any of you find yourself represented somewhere on that list with at least one or maybe more of those storm clouds on the horizon of your life? Some of you are like, I didn't, but I do now. Thanks a lot. It's a wonderful Terra Firma session. Hear these words about the storm again. It is expected and it's necessary. There was another sociologist named Christian Smith who began a long, multi-year study of faith formation about 12 years ago. Here's how the study worked. He and his research team started interviewing middle schoolers. They would send them a questionnaire, get the responses back, and then do follow-up questions. Every 2 or 3 years, they would repeat the conversations with the same people to kind of map out how does their faith formation work. As he looked at all of that, talked about their spiritual practices, their view of God, he came up with a term to describe, by and large, how many of us in American Western culture view faith. His long, fancy term for it was moral therapeutic deism. Let me break those 3 words down pretty simply. Moral, he said, everybody agrees that basically we should be pretty good people, defined by kind of being nice, don't hurt people, that kind of morality. Oh, and by the way, most of us feel like I can decide that for myself. I don't need somebody telling me how that works. That's the moral part. The therapeutic part says their view of God says God basically wants you to be comfortable. He's your therapist. He wants you to be happy. And so as long as you're basically good and basically nice, God is going to be basically good and basically nice to you. The deism part, probably you remember from kind of the early American fathers, often were deists. They believed that God was kind of like the giant watchmaker who wound up the watch, set it into motion, and then had nothing more to do with it. So there is God, there is religion, but quite honestly, it has very little to do with our actual life. And he said, by and large, that's the description of how many of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, view our faith. Here's the problem. When moral therapeutic deism hits the storm, it gets obliterated. Because if you're feeling like I'm basically a good person, bad stuff shouldn't happen to me, and the external storm hits, relational loss, financial stress, grief, when death hits moral therapeutic deism, there's no place to go. Because your basic belief is like, I'm a pretty good person, bad stuff shouldn't happen to me. When you're wrestling with the internal storm, these things that I mentioned, depression, anxiety, guilt, you find yourself feeling like these are emotions and feelings that shouldn't be experienced by a Christian. I can't be a Christian and be depressed. I can't be a Christian and be experiencing same-sex attraction. I can't be a Christian and struggle. I can't be a Christian and fill in the blank. And the shame just continues to pile on. When you hit the philosophical storm in all of this and all you're left with is a God who's basically disconnected from the day-to-day life, you end up kind of with what was described last week for us by Adam Barr as existentialism, just sort of like, I'm just going to get all that I can in this life because there's no meaning anyway. That's why this storm is necessary. It brings us back to the foundation. With a Christian worldview, which you're going to be writing about, when the external storm hits, we go back to Scripture and we discover we can lament. We are not immune as followers of Christ from bad things happening. Neither was Job, neither was Paul, neither was Jesus. When they hit the external storm, like the psalmist and like Jesus, we can cry out in anguish. We can say, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And we can acknowledge rather than hide that truth. Psalms are full of verses like that. In the moments of internal storm, we can reach out in trusted community. What if the storm internally could actually draw us together as brothers and sisters in Christ, where we don't have to pretend that good Christians have it all together? What if we can acknowledge that depression, anxiety, lust, and fear and loneliness could meet compassion and solidarity when we meet together as brothers and sisters rather than trying to offer each other quick, easy answers? In those moments of doubt and confusion by the philosophical storm, what if we lean into those conversations rather than away from them? One of the greatest gifts that was given to me during my undergrad years was a conversation with Ron. Ron was a couple years older than I was, and he and I were on our way back to Chicago after a brass quintet concert that we had played in. And we were driving somewhere along I-55, and I don't remember how we got on the topic, but I suddenly found myself talking to Ron about doubts in my faith. Here's how it crystallized for me. I'm a missionary kid. I grew up in the United Arab Emirates. And the very simple picture in my mind was, having been born at this missions hospital, what if I was one crib over and I was the kid who went home with the Muslim family rather than the kid who went home with the Christian family? It was the question of, have I simply been indoctrinated into believing in Christianity because of the people that I grew up with, or do I believe it because it's true? If I had gone home with the Arabic family, would I believe in Islam instead? Here's how Ron responded when I kind of like vomited all of this out in the car. He simply looked and said, that's a great question. You should actually check that out. Look into any other religion, and if you find anything more than Christ, more compelling than Christ, you should pursue it. And I actually believe Ron meant it. You see, Ron had actually been in that same place. Ron had been in the storm a couple of years earlier, and he gave me permission to go through the storm, trusting that on the other side of it, my foundation would be more solid, and he was right. So as we think about this transition from inherited faith to owned faith, as we think about the storm, what are some final words of advice? How do we navigate through that? I wrote down 3 thoughts. Number 1, find a guide who has made their way through the storm. Someone you can ask honest, tough, and real questions. Find someone like I did, like Ron. There are lots of people like that on this campus. They're all over the place if you just ask. Number 2, find a place of harbor and rest in the storm, a place of real, honest community. You need a place that welcomes your lament when life sucks. You need a place that allows you to doubt. You need a place that won't dismiss the storm or be like, hey, let's see if we can change the weather. You need a place that will simply shelter you for a while and acknowledge the storm. Number 3, and perhaps most importantly, look for Jesus in the midst of the storm. You know the story. In the midst of a storm, Christ is sleeping and the disciples finally cry out in fear. It's actually a cry of doubt when you look at the scripture. It's this gut-level, honest prayer that actually serves us well in the storm. In the midst of the storm, the disciples cry out, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And Jesus responds, and they actually get to see his power over the storm. Here's what I'm convinced of. I'm convinced not only that the storm is expected and necessary, but I'm convinced that on the other side of the storm, in this journey from inherited to owned faith, you'll find your faith more rich, more precious, more complex, and more your own. That's certainly been true for me, and as difficult as each season of storm is, because there's sometimes coming additional storms, I'm grateful for them. So one of the ways that we as a community try to make this a place where it's safe to navigate through the storm is worshiping regularly together. That's one of our goals. And I've appreciated and learned a lot from Susan Berner's leadership and involvement in our chapel program. We've intentionally paired my talk on the journey from inherited to owned faith with her talk on why we gather regularly for chapel. To be honest, I feel a little old introducing Susan for a Terra Firma talk because I was involved in leading the very first Terra Firma program here at Cornerstone when she was a freshman, freshly graduated from South Christian High School. She got her degree in worship arts at Cornerstone in 2013 and has been working with the chapel program ever since. Now oversees discipleship and global service in addition to her work with chapel. She and her husband, Nick, who's also a CU grad, are both students at the seminary at GRTS. And here's a little known fact about Susan. For 3 years, she was also the resident director of Keithley and was the mastermind and creator behind the Powder Puff halftime show. So please welcome Susan.
Can you hang in for a third? Yes? Good. I studied the Trinity last night in my theology class at the seminary. 3 is awesome. You might not be feeling that right now. I'm sorry if you're not. So the past few weeks, you have learned so many things. And I don't just mean in your classes, right? Think through your first couple days on campus. Did you have any idea, if the little sign had not told you, that this scary, really messy, kind of gross drawer in the cafeteria was where your silverware went, right? Or maybe every night before your classes the next day, you had to look up your course schedule. You had to remember what classes you had when, where they were. You had to remind yourself. And you constantly had to remember, I need to take my ID card everywhere. Although there's probably still some seniors that are trying to figure that one out. But do those things consume your thoughts as much anymore? Not really. You kind of just do them, right? Why? Because you've done them repeatedly over and over. You've gone to class, you've eaten meals, and hopefully you haven't gotten locked out of the dorms too many times because you forgot your ID card. And as you've done those things over and over again, you have been formed and shaped to do something in a particular way. So what on earth does that have to do with chapel and why we worship even together? Well, the practices that we repeatedly engage in as a community shape us and form us. And one of the main practices that we do together is worship together here in chapel. So when we gather, it's not simply to fill time or to do something together because it's good. The stakes are higher. It shapes us. More specifically, it shapes our loves. In his book, You Are What You Love, Jamie Smith acknowledges there's often a gap between what we think and what we do. Consider that for a moment. Have you ever done something that you knew you shouldn't have done or you thought you just should have done it differently? Like maybe a friend, clearly wasn't doing well, but you just quick ran to your car and didn't have time to have a conversation because you wanted to get home. Why did you do that? You knew you should have stopped and talked to them, but instead, you desired to go home more than you desired to talk to your friend. And that sounds super harsh, but out of that thinking, Smith says that we are what we desire, or we are what we love, and that's because we live towards what we ultimately want, not necessarily what we think. So he describes the heart like a compass. It points us to how we're going to live, but we constantly need to recalibrate it and redirect it because our compass gets off. So how do we do that? How do we redirect our loves? He says that we learn to love not primarily by acquiring information about what we should love, but rather through practices that form the habits of how we love. So how do we form habits? Well, 2 ways, by imitation and repetition. Think about brushing your teeth. When you were little, your parents had to imitate for you, even on you, right, how to brush your teeth. And yes, dental hygiene requires it to be done repeatedly, but it had to be done repeatedly for you, so you learned it. You didn't just learn how to brush your teeth once instantly. And now, hopefully, and if not, great reminder for you, you brush your teeth. You don't even think about it. It just happens. You do it. To bring this from the bathroom sink to the chapel here, we worship together to recalibrate our loves through imitation and repetition. And this is a spiritual matter because what we love the most is what we will ultimately worship. What we desire the most is what we declare most worthy of our love. And while as Christians, we'd like to say, and even think a lot of times, that we love God the most, our behavior and actions often say otherwise. Martin Luther, one of the reformers we've learned about this semester, said that whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that really is your God. See, we don't get a choice as to whether we'll worship. We were all created to worship. We will worship something. What we do get to choose is what or who we will worship. And again, if we're honest, we often don't worship the right thing. We were created as God's image bearers to be small representations of him to the world and to reflect his image back to him and bring him glory, like we talked about in chapel this morning. But often, because we're not loving the right thing, we don't do this. We instead reflect back selfishness or pride, hunger for approval. The list could go on and on and on. We don't feel our created purpose because we don't love God, the highest, constantly. And so here at Cornerstone, hopefully it's been obvious by now, and if not, here it is. We are about the gospel, repeatedly rehearsing the gospel when we gather together. And really quickly, there's so much more that could be said, but in the most basic form, the gospel is the biblical story and narrative that God created the world good, but because humans didn't love God the most, it became broken and fallen and sinful. But this is the great news. God, in his gracious mercy, did not leave his children in their sins. He promised a Savior for redemption, his Son, Jesus Christ, who died and was raised to life so that as his children, those who have faith might inherit eternal life through the power of the Spirit and one day be united when he returns, restoration. So much more could be said there, but that story is foundational to the Christian faith, and that story actually orders our loves. We need to be reminded of the false gods, the false ways that we reflect God to the world. Confess that to him, but not just stay there in our shame and our brokenness, but to look to our Savior and see the infinite amount of love and grace that he offers and praise him and glorify him for that. So the content of any worship gathering is a matter of rightly ordering our loves. So the students who lead and plan chapel services evaluate every element of those services against that criteria. Every prayer, scripture, and song is truly evaluated against, does it declare the gospel well? Participation in this is key, though. Remember, we said we're not just thinking beings. We can't just think ourselves into reordering our loves toward God. Think about maybe a time when you've heard a sermon and have been so inspired or convicted, you left it saying, wow, I am going to love God more. But then say you go and you just tell yourself, I'm going to love God more, I'm going to love God more, I'm going to love God more. Do you actually love God more after that? Not really. But what if instead you seek him in his word and learn more about him? Or maybe you go on a mission trip and engage with cultures of the world and learn about how God has beautifully created all people everywhere. Does that make you love God more? Yeah. Because we need to behaviorally do something and participate in something in order to shape our loves deeply. So, what does that have to do with chapel? Can you advance it back there? It's not working up here anymore. We don't just show up to corporate worship. We behaviorally participate in it and for it to shape our loves. But sometimes we're not inclined to participate, right? Maybe it's because it's unfamiliar. We're uncomfortable, we don't like it, we'd rather do something else. I know one of the things that freshmen often feel in the first couple weeks of chapel is they don't know some of the songs that we do here. And obviously there's a vast amount of backgrounds here that we're working with, but know that the worship leaders carefully select the songs that are sung in chapel based on how to faithfully proclaim the gospel and every aspect of it together. That's not to say they're the best songs, and even more complicated, won't get into this too much, but even more complicated, every single one of us has a different criteria and agenda for how we would evaluate what is the best song, right? But what can unite us beyond our musical preferences or preferences for speaking style or anything, what unites us together is the truth that we are being reminded of, and that's actually forming us. It may also be unfamiliar or uncomfortable to sing in a different language. You may have noticed we do that here. And the intention here, too, is that we're reforming our loves to be more faithfully gospel and Christ-centered people by recognizing various cultures in our world. All of these elements that we participate in should be reshaping our loves.
So did I compare to coming to chapel with brushing your teeth today? In some ways, I guess I did. And I so recognize that there are days that you will not want to come. You will not want to take the time to come. You just won't want to be here. Full disclosure, and this will shock some of you. I am over a lot of the content of chapel, not all of it, but a lot. And there are days where I don't want to come. What? Right? Shocking? But in those moments, I need to remind myself that I attend not because it's a good thing to do, not because I'll hopefully hear a song that I really like, or even because it's a job requirement for me, a different kind of requirement for you, but because I so desperately need my loves recalibrated, reoriented toward my Savior, to whom I owe my whole life. So why do we regularly gather to worship on a Christian college campus when there are a million other things that we could be doing with our time? One of the best reasons, I believe, is that we need to regularly to reorder our loves through repetitious practice of the gospel story, through acts of corporate worship together as a community, not in isolation. To be a Christ-centered university, we must regularly practice behaviors that keep our loves Christ-centered. And I hope you'll consider that the next time we gather.
So we're going to dismiss into our groups and have a reflection time, but just kind of to recap all that we've talked about, your assignment is due November 15th. Do not forget, it is 20% of your grade. 20%. That's a lot. So let's turn it in by November 15th. We have a ton of events for Family Weekend, so go sign up. Bring your friends, bring your fam, bring your friends that are fam, whatever you want. And just give a quick thank you to everyone who spoke today. They took time out of their days to come hang out with us, so that's super cool. Terra Firma leaders, the discussion questions are down here if you want to come grab them, and then you can go into your groups. Thanks, guys.